Before we start, I just would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, also known today as the Sanghees and Kasapsam nations. And with that, I just want to welcome everyone to this session. We have the delight to have four distinguished local elected officials with us today to share more about some of the impacts that global crises are having on their communities when it comes to rising levels of hate and social polarization and what they as elected local leaders are doing about that. But before we get started, I just want to introduce one of our sponsors for this event from the U.S. Consulate in Vancouver, the Vice Consul Joseph Garrity, to say a few words on behalf of the consulate.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure for the U.S. Consulate and the U.S. Mission to Canada to co-sponsor this conference and this event tonight as part of our overall mission to bring our two countries even closer together. It's awe-inspiring to see four mayors from both sides of the border sitting together here tonight, as we saw them earlier today, to talk to us, to share their shared experience. So it's really an honor for me to be here and for us to be helping to make this happen. I want to say personally, sitting and listening this afternoon to some of the challenges you all face, brought it home for me. My sister is a school board member in rural Wisconsin. My dad was a city council member in the town where I grew up. I have a real sense of what it is to be in local government, and I think we all owe you some gratitude for the service that you provide, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph, for that and for the support for our work here in Canada. Next, I just want to invite someone to the stage to set the scene. Our partner organization or host organization, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, does a lot of research and analysis on particularly the online threats that so many of our communities are facing in North America. And we're delighted to have Catherine Keneally, who's the director of that program in the United States, here to share some of their research and their analysis, and that will feed into then the conversation with our local leaders. So, Catherine.
Thank you, Eric. Evening, everyone. As he said, I am Catherine Keneally. I am the Director of Threat Analysis and Prevention at ISD. You know, I must say it feels a little bit odd to be in Canada at the moment with the U.S. election only 6 days away and what might be one of the most watched U.S. elections in recent memory. And based on the news this morning, Canada is certainly watching. And then when I went back to my room again and turned on the news, and then again, it appears that Canadian news is more focused on the election than I think I am at the moment. But it's also quite fitting, right? I mean, you know, what happens in the U.S. doesn't stay in the U.S. any more than what we're seeing online isn't staying online. So today's threat landscape is very different from that of 20 years ago. While the threat of terrorist groups and their influence on violence in the West has grown, retreated, and then returned, the current threat landscape is also driven by a very diverse and complicated online ecosystem filled with hate, extremism, conspiracy theories, and foreign influence that is shaping the offline threats that we are experiencing in our communities. Whether you live in a village of a few hundred people or whether you're in a city of millions, we are all feeling the impacts of what is happening online. We are feeling it in the form of hate crimes to members of marginalized communities motivated by the Israel-Hamas conflict, or conspiracy theories aimed at migrants being blamed for the housing crisis. We see it in the threats to our public officials that are sent via phone, email, social media, regular mail, in person, driven by everything from anti-Semitism to manipulated information. And I know that the city of Victoria has directly felt the impact of this, having recently been forced to disable comments on social media after they were contributing to the abuse and harassment of city staffers. We're also feeling it in the vandalism of private and public property driven by anti-LGBTQ plus hates and anti-government beliefs. We feel it in the swattings, the bomb threats, in the recruitment of our youth by dangerous and violent extremist groups such as active clubs, or in some of the worst incidents, political violence. that are targeting communities of people based on white supremacist or other beliefs or because of a group's protected characteristics. At the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, we self-describe as a think and do tank. We conduct research on the intersection of hate, extremism, and mis and disinformation online to better understand how this online ecosystem is influencing offline activities. And we work with practitioners like you on the ground to provide actionable insights to support the efforts to counter these rising threats. And what we are continuing to see is that the information being shared online, either intentionally by domestic extremist groups or fringe media or foreign actors, or unintentionally by our neighbors and fellow citizens, is having significant impacts. It's influencing people to engage in behavior, even violent actions that they previously might not have, influenced by this very curated and manipulated information environment. Our organization has been tracking increases in hate and extremist rhetoric online, targeting some of the most vulnerable communities, such as indigenous populations, immigrants, and LGBTQ plus people in recent years. And we continue to see violent language used so frequently online that it can feel like identifying credible threats is like finding the needle in the biggest haystack on the planet. I mean, all you have to do is go to the comment section of literally any posts, and there will be no shortage of violent rhetoric. And what we're seeing now is that the election conspiracy theories that were very US-centric are no longer unique to the US, as we have seen in the recent election in British Columbia. And we are continuing to see that individuals deeply entrenched in conspiracy theories are engaging in violence. You know, there is no silver bullet to this problem. There's no single tool, I'm sorry to say, that's going to be released and, fix this and turn back the internet. There's no single policy. But we do know a few things, right? What research has shown is that we know that responsible and accurate reporting is more important now than ever. We know that we need to work to hold bad actors accountable who are manipulating the internet for self-serving reasons, whether it be nation states or whether it's violent extremists. And we know that there are changes that need to be made to ensure that social media companies are also being held accountable for enabling this threat environment that exists today. But in addition to this, we know that one of the most important keys to solve these issues is actually right here in this room. Polling has shown that local community leaders, be it our local governments, our religious leaders, or those in our community organizations, have a characteristic that very few today have, and that's trust. That is trust from your communities. In addition, nobody knows your community like you do. Nobody understands the challenges that they face, the actual grievances, or the reasons why people are experiencing these things that make them more susceptible to identifying with or believing conspiracy theories or latching onto extremist beliefs. No one understands like you what fears or experiences your community is having. Regardless, these are global problems. We continue to hear throughout this that global crises, local solutions, but that could not ever ring more true, because when it comes to solving this threat that is so pervasive around the world, the solution to the problem are the local leaders. It's you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those framing remarks, Catherine. I think that sets the stage wonderfully. And before we proceed, I just want to, for those of our millions of viewers online, just want to underscore that the work that we're doing here is the result of a collaboration with a number of organizations and partners. I mentioned the U.S. Consulate, but there's also the Foundation for a Path Forward, Tariq and Yusuf. There's also Public Safety Canada. Robert's here from the Canada Centre. There's the Attorney General's office in British Columbia as well that's supporting this, and of course the City of Victoria. So none of this could be possible without them. But now let me give the floor over to our distinguished mayors and vice mayors. The question I would ask is, Catherine has painted a picture that's quite complex, quite probably different than the environment that maybe when you ran for office originally you thought you were entering into. The kinds of global issues that are impacting all of your cities, the complexity of them, How has that impacted your role as a mayor and your ability to lead? And what sort of changes have you had to make as a result of all of these global crises, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's the war in Israel and Gaza, migration? So maybe we'll start with you, Chris. And maybe before you start, you can introduce your city a little bit and to give some context.
Lito, my name is Chris Roberts. I currently serve as the mayor of Shoreline, Washington. It's a city just north of the city of Seattle. We're a city of about 65,000 people now, with a population of individuals who are foreign born around 21%. And we're a city, like I think many others here, whose demographics have been changed quite a lot over the last 10 years. We now, within our school district, which includes the city of Shoreline and the city of Lake Forest Park, it's now 50% people of color who are students of color in the school district. So a vast change from where it was when the district first came about. I'll just first say that I've learned a lot from my colleagues and who have even probably perhaps even more impactful stories than mine. But I will say that the threats that we face seem greater and harder to deal with than ever before. I wrote I had the privilege to write an op-ed for the Seattle Times earlier this year talking about the rise of political violence against local elected officials, where 50% of local elected officials have been harassed and 2% of elected officials within the last 3 months have been threatened by violence. And I think there's some examples on this panel who may share some of those stories. But it's an environment that's difficult for us to navigate. There are times where we have to tiptoe around issues and sensitive issues, not because we're not passionate about the issues or because we have strong opinions, but because we have a community that's divided. The community that has strong, politics is about passion, but when the passions are almost too strong, when the passions are about one's identity or it's more than the allocation of scarce resources, but when it is this pervasive sense that I'm 100% right and you're 100% wrong, that's not an environment that works. And as elected officials, we grow thick skin. If we don't have thick skins when we run for office, we grow thick skins. But the reality of this is when the hate speech has a real impact on individuals. That even with thick skin, it's hard to keep going some days. There's a mental toll that comes about when people are constantly not just saying I disagree with you about politics and policies, but when you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And you're wrong because of this characteristic you have, it's hard to keep going. And at least in the United States, we have a mental health crisis and an underfunded mental health system. And so for individuals who are engaged and want to make their voice heard, but are constantly pushed down, constantly discriminated against, constantly bullied, people suffer, real people suffer. And there's too many people suffering because of what's happening right now.
Thank you. And Doreen, over to you in Tempe, Arizona. I know Tempe's the home of Arizona State University, lots of different nationalities represented on that campus. So how has these global crises sort of through that lens of being a university town in some respects impacted your work on the council and sort of forced you to think differently about your role as a counselor?
So I think Tempe, Arizona, we have 196,000 residents in Tempe, and it's a very diverse community. It's a beautiful community. You'll have to come visit. But during the school year, we increased our population by about 60,000 because of the students that are coming into our schools. And there's a lot of global crises and issues that happen around the world, and we have 157 different countries that are represented in ASU. So a lot of issues and discussions that happen are from other countries. Now, we have had protests at ASU over some global issues that have happened, and I think we've had to kind of look at that as making sure that people are allowed to protest. It's freedom of speech, they're allowed to do it, but make sure that we are doing that in our community in a very safe way, allowing people to be able to express themselves. We have had issues where somebody has had a hate crime against them, and we have found the person that did that, and we have prosecuted them. It's really important in our community that you're allowed to speak, but you're not allowed to hurt somebody else. What we learned from all of that was that it's really important for us in our community, and this has happened before I got onto council, is that we have built really strong relationships with many different parts of our community. And at ASU, the relationship with the school itself, but with different community members. And we found that that is really important, because when we have something like a crisis, something like a protest that might not go as well as we would like it to go, we have already formed those relationships with people in our community, so we know who to pick up the phone and call. What we have been lucky enough with is that because of those relationships, we have had people who wanted to have a protest or a march in our community. Because of those relationships we've already formed, have called us up and said, hey, we're going to be marching in your community. We want to go from here to here. And they do it, and it's absolutely fine. But I think it's really important for us to realize that there is free speech and letting people do this, but there's also a way to do it safely. And we have been able to find a way to do that by building these relationships that we've found that are really, really important.
Thank you. And Mayor Sohi, what's been the impact in Edmonton and your role as mayor as a result of all these global crises?
First of all, hello again. And to the million people who are listening to, millions of people who are listening to us, thank you so much for joining us. And this opportunity is actually, this is a very good conversation. We talk about the impact on us as elected officials, but I do also want to acknowledge that the work that we do is absolutely not possible without the support of our families, right? And my wife Sarbjit is here. I'm pretty sure your partners feel it as well, in a way that the impact of the attacks that we see in on social media or in the community, not only we feel it, but our families feel it, right? And I think it's important that we acknowledge it's not just us, it's the entire family that is being impacted. So, but I am optimistic. I'll tell you why. I think what we have gone through, what this world has gone through, something that we were never prepared for. Like, as countries, as nations, we prepare for wars, right? Rightfully or wrongfully. I don't believe in wars, but as nations, we do prepare for wars. But we never prepared for one of the biggest things that has happened to our world is the pandemic. We were never prepared for it. And we were expecting it to last maybe a couple of weeks, couple of months, but it lasted for 3 years. And here we are sitting in this room. I think what we have survived and how we have survived out of that speaks to the resiliency of our communities. It speaks to the resiliency of our people. So what I think about is that if we can survive that, we can survive this phase as well. We can come out of this stronger, but we need tools. As elected officials, local elected officials, we need tools. I think that's what I want to focus on. We are lacking those tools. As local governments, our primary role is to provide day-to-day services that people rely on. We want to make sure public transit is running on time. your garbage being collected on time, recreational centers are open, fire department shows up, police is giving you the protection that you need. But we don't have the capacity and the skills to deal with the impact of global issues on local communities. We are seeing the impact, whether it's climate change, whether it's what is happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Ukraine. Uh, we are multicultural communities. Edmonton's population is probably 40% uh, uh, non-white population. Very diverse, multicultural city, and continues to grow. Phenomenal city. I love my city. It's just a phenomenal place to be. But we don't have the tools to deal with some of those global issues. And what gives me hope is this organization, your organization, that will somehow give us listening to our collective voices, and out of those collective voices coming up with some plans and strategies and best practices that we can actually start implementing to tackle those global issues that are impacting our local people, and they are impacting our social cohesion in a ways that we have never thought we will be facing.
Thank you, Mayor Sohi, and keep the tip, keep the change, for that plug for our work. Thank you. But we can't do our work without the engagement with our partners in our cities. So we're only as strong as our cities are engaged with us. So we thank you for all of that engagement from your city. And speaking of another city that's deeply engaged with us, and we're grateful for that, is the City of Victoria and Mayor Alto. So you just organized before this event, our event, a conference on community well-being. And tell us a little bit about how that sort of emphasis on community well-being is sort of maybe further prioritized given the global context in which we're all living. Like, why that priority for you right now?
That's a great question, and thank you again to the billions of people who are watching. For those of you who have not yet had a chance to visit Victoria, just a quick recap. We just crested 100,000 people in the city itself, but we're the downtown for an area of about 400,000, so we deal in a concentrated area within the city with many urban concerns, I guess, for a much larger area. The thing that's unique about Victoria that I think is relevant to this is that, unlike the rest of British Columbia, 60% of our population are renters. And so in the rest of the province, the majority of people actually own property, but that's not the case here. And our median income is about $45,000, actually the least in the entire capital region. For that reason, we have a really fascinating conundrum, because we have a small population with limited income, a limited land size. We're only a little over 19 square kilometers as well. And yet we provide services, policing services, economic services, entertainment services, a whole variety of services, not the least of which is protest services because of the legislature next door. And we pay for all of that. So that really is important to remember, because it's such a huge strain on the pocketbooks of the few people who live here. At the same time, we have a very eclectic population, much more so than most people think. In the last 20 years, our population demographics have changed dramatically. 20 years ago, you would have said the average age was about 64. Right now, it's 45. And with that has also come a significant shift in the type of people who are here. The largest industry in the city of Victoria is not the legislature and not retirement. It's actually the tech sector. There's over 600 tech companies in the city of Victoria. And so just describing those few simple things give you a sense that the city is not what people think it is and not what it used to be. That means, though, that the change that's happened has brought with it division. It's also brought cohesion, and it's that sort of tension between the two things that I think is relevant to this conversation, and why it is that the current City Council, in identifying 8 priorities for this term, very much put one front and center, and that's community well-being and safety. It's because of the divisions and the cohesion that are working in tension right here that we're beginning to see the manifestation in the context of everything else that's happening in the world around division, that those people who have been the most negatively affected over the years about the changes in the demographics, primarily our Indigenous population and primarily our largest non-white population, which is essentially Asian, Those two have been really significantly impacted by what's happening from the perspective of much more visible hate and much more visible racism, but also from the perspective of being, at least in the indigenous population, much more visible in our unhoused population. So when you bring together all of these combinations of the stresses around economies for everyone, the stresses around housing for everyone, we are the fourth most expensive city in the country now, from all perspectives, not just housing. From the perspective of clearly a divided province, if you look at the recent election, which is only just in the last few days been settled in a very narrow majority, you have a city which is, I think, emblematic of the shifts, the change, the demands, and the controversy that are being affected not just by world events, but by events right here. And I think that's an important point to make, because our drive to try and bring some reimagination to community well-being is really being catalyzed by the fact that the impact of those great big things, which you describe as being hard to respond to, are having direct impact on individuals who are living here. Now, the reality of the stress of the people here who are affected by family, by the things that are happening overseas, that's one thing. But at the same time, the stress that that's creating across the entire community means that the impact of what is our usual division and oppression is actually exacerbated. So we have a special obligation, I think, at this point in our time in the evolution of our city, to be able to look really carefully at what is practical, what is realistic about how we change the lives of the people who are most oppressed within the city. They're not different than many other cities. They're different in demographics perhaps a little, but they are fundamentally the same. And I just want to actually, let me take a moment to be provocative. I actually disagree with my colleague from Edmonton. I do think that there is a responsibility for us to do roads and water and garbage and all that stuff. But I actually think that the impact of the changes in the world and all of the things that we're talking about today around hate speech and racism and discrimination and all of these violences actually has pushed cities into a place that they haven't been in centuries. And that is in a place where it's not just enough for us to deliver services. It's now time for us to deliver lives and to deliver futures which allow people to be front and center in the decisions that cities are making with them and for them, and that the cities have to actually take power from other orders of government, including the checks that go with them, to be able to say, as you said earlier, no one knows better than my council what my people need and want. I can't deliver that on an 1856 order that divides the fiscal framework where I get 8.5 cents of every tax dollar. So this is a big conversation.
I agree.
Yeah, I know you do. This is a big conversation that we're having in the larger scheme, but it is relevant to this conversation because as city-states become more in tune to what their own people need, the more the rest of the orders of government have to be part of this conversation. And it is relevant to what's happening around hate speech and discrimination, because that's that leveler, that's the context in which we're all working right now. And I don't remember, were you at UBCM this year? I can't remember. No, you wouldn't be. The Union of BC Municipalities, this is really quick, I'm sorry to take up this much time, had a really unique session this year. This is the organization that is the rallying point for municipalities. For the first time in their history, they had a session on mental health and elected officials. 300 people attended it. And the one thing that stuck out for me, and it is relevant to this whole conversation, is that one of the pieces of advice that was garnered for us by the Lieutenant Governor, who was one of the facilitators, was to say this observation. People think that the longer you're in public office, the thicker your skin gets. That's not true. The better you get at hiding it, so that you can actually keep going. And if that isn't a damning sentence on the quality of our democracy, I don't know what is.
Thank you, Mayor Alto, for putting this conversation in a much more, in a broader context, and making the problems that we're talking about seem like drops in the bucket. But I think two questions I want to ask each of you, and you can answer one or both in your answer, is around disinformation, misinformation, and the police. They're separate, potentially related, but separate. So we hear a lot about community safety, public safety, community well-being, but we don't hear a lot about the police in these conversations often, because depending on the city, the jurisdiction of the mayor doesn't extend to the police. But how in your cities has the relationship with the police been impacted by some of these changes, whether demographic changes, whether global crises? That's one question. The other question would be on a lot of these issues are being, that you've highlighted, have been inflamed by the conspiracy narratives and the disinformation that many of your citizens are vulnerable to being influenced by. So how have you as a mayor or vice mayor sort of tried to tackle that piece of this issue? So we'll go to you, Mayor Roberts.
Sure, thank you. Shoreline is, in fact, a news desert. We have one remarkable woman and a couple people who sort of help volunteer with her, who run essentially a community blog for both Shoreline and Lake Forest Park, and that's it. The paper of record for us, the Seattle Times, has not covered any election in Shoreline since 2012. There's been a few elections since then, or 2013, sorry. So, I mean, our residents are not getting information about what's happening in local government. They're not, except for whatever press releases are sent, and the one currently now there is a sort of one person volunteer who is helping with sort of put context and help our residents understand what's actually happening. But that's a challenge for us, in that we have to go. It's harder for us to get our message out. It's harder for us to talk about the wonderful things we're doing in the city. It's harder to talk about our successes. So this is where I'm bridging the two topics, but we recognized early on, I think even before 2020, but that our police are not doing, they've been responding to a lot of things that are not traditional police activities. They're responding to crises, and our fire department is the same way, is responding to crises that are the same, that sort of ongoing crisis. The individual who might have the same, sort of the individuals who sort of constantly using drugs, or the individual who's is involved in a mental health episode and nothing really is able to calm that individual down. And the police are responding to them, and the police are wonderful and important assets in our community. But that's not the type of job that police are traditionally have been trained to do. And so around 2019, 2020, we as a council intentionally recognized this as a problem, and we formed first helped form an organization that's now called RACE, or Regional Crisis Response. And so we have, within the 5 cities in North King County, Shoreline, Lake Forest Park, Bothell, Kirkland, and Kenmore, we have a dozen sort of full-time mental health responders who are going out on calls. And they are dealing with a whole lot of issues, individuals who are without homes. They're often the first point of contact, and the person who sort of helps individuals get to the resources they need. And our police have embraced this really strongly embraced this model, because our police chief knew that their response and their officers are not properly trained to handle these situations, that a qualified mental health person is the best person to be able to solve these underlying problems and to point people to the resources they need. And our police across the 5 cities really support this model. And I think this is the future of policing, is that police are necessary for sort of what we know as crimes, but in terms of sort of other things that people need responses to, this RACER program is, I think, the model. And I think there's other models in other cities. That Eugene has the COOS model, but these kind of models of co-response is the way forward.
Doreen from Tempe.
Yeah, I was going to say, We're very similar to what Mayor Roberts was just saying. In the city of Tempe, we've had a program called HOPE, and it's our it's our homeless outreach program. And I think all the police departments have had to adapt in the last few years to the care and the needs of your community. And for our community, it was that when you see a person an unsheltered person in your community that needs help, the first call shouldn't be to the police department. It should be the HOPE outreach team. And that HOPE outreach team goes, and they are not in uniform, but they are people that have lived experience. It's 24/7. You can make a phone call, and then they will come out and work with the person that you've called them about. It's not the police that goes out there first. Police should be doing other police issue things. The police department also created, or have had, and we've increased, a community outreach program. And our police officers are constantly in our community doing neighborhood things so that you have an opportunity to go and meet with our officers at different events and actually talk to them and learn a little bit more about the policing in the city of Tempe. The other thing that they did is, we were talking earlier about hate crimes and hate issues. It was our police department that worked with our diversity department to host an event with our marginalized communities to try to come up with a process on how to report hate crimes in our community. We wanted the input of the community, and especially those marginalized communities. It was our police department and our diversity department that got together and did that and came up with this guide that allows our residents to be able to see this, be able to make these phone calls, and find themselves in an environment where they're physically and mentally safe to be able to report hate crimes. So I think our police departments have all had to adapt and really focus on what the needs are in the community, and I'm really proud of what they've been able to do. It's very similar to what Mayor Roberts was just talking about.
Mayor Sohi.
Yeah, so the structure, the way it's set up in Alberta is that police, like mayor and councils have no control how police operates, because police is governed under the Police Act. Under the Police Act, local communities are required to create independent police commission body to which we make appointments. Once that is done, that's entirely the police commission's job to oversee the police as well as how the funding is being allocated. Only thing we get to do is write a check, right? Which is frustrating, right? Because it's a lot of money that we spend on policing, but there's very little direct accountability to council. It was created, again, going back to the creation of municipalities under 1867 model that doesn't work anymore. But I think we can change that. But so what we do, first of all, I agree with my colleagues that many of the challenges that we're facing in our communities that do give rise to crime and disorder are rooted in the social issues. So if we can actually start focusing on the social determinants of people's well-being and health, we can actually end up making a much more difference in their lives, but also reduce a lot of policing cost. But again, that goes back to what limited tools we have. So if in an ideal world, I think local governments can offer so many solutions if we were given the legislative authority and if we are given the resources to live those legislative authorities, and we can make actually not only save tons of money to the taxpayers, but also make our communities much better by investing in well-being. Because without well-being, I don't know if we can actually build safer communities, right? Well-being so essential for building safer communities, and our communities are not well. We have seen houselessness almost double or triple in Edmonton over the last 4 years coming out of COVID. We have the worst overdose crisis that we're facing because of addictions crisis we have, and almost, I think, close to 70% of the calls from our fire department are actually opiate-related overdoses, right? So we're spending $28 million of fire service resources responding to a healthcare crisis, So the crises we have are actually a well-being and healthcare and mental health. If we have the resources to tackle those, we can actually make a meaningful difference in the lives of people. We're doing what we can. Like, for example, we invested $10 million in crisis diversion teams. They're out there helping people. We have social workers working along with our peace officers on our public transit, where people are able to connect people, vulnerable people, to service instead of getting them into the justice systems. Right. So it's very complex. It's not just the police officers do their best, but they're not social workers, right? They're not healthcare workers. They're not mental health care workers. I think that's the challenge, and that all those services are underinvested. And that's why we're seeing all these challenges in our major urban centers and other communities as well.
Mayor Alto?
Well, ditto to all of that stuff. There's no doubt at all that certainly if I'm going to focus on the future and what the community well-being and safety plan is likely to include, I mean, there's no doubt that police have an incredibly important part. They're not going to go away, at least not in Victoria. But there's also no doubt that their jobs have to change. The public has changed over the years. Their expectations of policing changes in the same way. We piloted a couple of years ago a program that we call Clicker, which is a community-led crisis response team, which has no police involved whatsoever. They're just health professionals. And there's a different number you can call, and they come out and they deal with the issue. And if there's crime involved, then they call the police. In the first 2 years of their program, they answered over 2,500 calls, and 5 of them went to the police. So it works. And it worked well enough that we actually managed to convince the provincial government that it was something they should do everywhere. They finally said yes, and so now it's in 12 different communities in the province, and now they're paying, which is appropriate. But it's a great example of what municipalities can model in order to prove a particular pilot or a particular idea and pay for it for a while, and hopefully get the appropriate, more different order of government to pick it up. But I think the whole notion of municipalities looking at their responsibilities around community safety, I think, starts with that discussion about how much are you willing to invest upstream as opposed to just in the response. Police is one part of the response, Clicker teams, other teams, as you've described, also part of the response. But when you start looking at the cost of responding, and it's not just policing, and it's not just things like the civilian teams, but it's public works, it's bylaw, it's maintenance, it's emergency services, it's policing, yes. It's all of the contributions we make to all the nonprofits who are out there responding to all the crises as well. When you start breaking down the budget, we are spending significant portions of our budget responding to crises which we could prevent if we just did it the other way around. Our police budget is worth about 1/3 of our total municipal budget. But if we counteracted that by counting up all the amount of money we spend responding just outside the police, I'm going to make the argument that there'd be a big, big chunk that we could actually invest better, which would either allow the police budget to stay the same, but allow them to concentrate on crime, which is what they do well, or in fact, as you've suggested, perhaps even for it to lower. But regardless, there's no doubt in my mind, and I think this is going to emerge in the next little months, years perhaps, in a variety of municipalities, that we have to rethink where we're investing around crime and safety and well-being. We have to start deciding if we're going to move into those areas where traditionally we haven't been as municipal governments, and say we are going to invest directly into prevention, into education, into all of the upstream pieces that will interrupt and intervene so that we can spend less in response. That is not traditional, and it goes back to my earlier comments about the emergence of different authorities at the city government level. But I think that's what the people want, and I think it makes sense.
Thank you for that insight. I think one of the things we've learned from a number of our cities is how they've tried to navigate the issue of when the budget for public safety and the police is very, very large, and the budget for some of these other services is much smaller. How can you sort of tap into that security budget to actually cover some of these other more preventative upstream challenges? And just one small example is the city of Newark, New Jersey, where they used the police budget and basically got the police to pay for having social workers in every police precinct. But it was through the police budget. It wasn't a reallocation of budgeting, which is more complicated, obviously. But with that, we are going to open the floor for questions to our distinguished local leaders, both questions from the audience, online, and in the room. So please feel free to raise your hand, and one of my colleagues will bring you a microphone, and you can ask a question. Or if we have an online question, we can pose that.
Millions of observers, right?
Thank you. Mic check. Okay. So my name's Rebecca Losella. I'm proud to be a new permanent resident of Canada. Yay. Thank you, Canada. And I'm traumatized because I am a former Bernie Sanders delegate for the state of Washington, and I was a national Bernie Sanders delegate in 2016 in Seattle. I grew up in Washington, D.C., but moved to Seattle in 2007. And then before that for Barack in 2008 for Barack Obama. And Chris and I know each other from our involvement in politics in Washington State. He's the best person you could ever know, by the way. Sorry, Chris, I know it's embarrassing. But anyway, he's a wonderful person. And and I moved to Victoria, and I'm really nervous, but I'm going to say this, and I'm going to try to hold back on some things with respect to the people on the panel and other sensitivities in the room. But I moved to Victoria in January of 2022. I'm half Cherokee, I'm Indigenous, I'm half Dutch, or my father's Dutch, my mom's Cherokee. Long story short, I was basically abused medically in Victoria more than once. I was left to die at Victoria General, locked up in a room for 12 hours, and no one's done anything about that. I was discriminated against at Camosun and Royal Roads by people in the staff. I get bullied. I have left Victoria because the bullying has gotten so bad towards me, and it's become like a recreational sport now because I'm recognizable. I've been cyberbullied. The video is actually still on a major Victoria page. People have called me every single name in the book and insulted my people, and nothing has been done about it by Facebook or the people on the page. Meanwhile, I get called things like, I am going to. It's okay, but part of the problem, I think, is me being silenced in Victoria, so I'll just say that. And I'm getting there, but I've been called like a fat freak, an Indigenous freak, all kinds of stuff. I guess it's okay to do that for some reason because I'm sparkly. So I guess my question is, Chris has addressed it about how it affects people's lives. And I survived gun violence as well as an activist in the States, so I have PTSD already. But what are you going to do about the fact that not all Indigenous people are going to speak up the way I do? There are some that will, and but I'm taking on a huge weight, and I've been targeted in this city for no reason. And I want to know what the hell, excuse my language, is going to be done about that, because I am carrying a lot of pain from what this city has done to me. And when I have stood up for myself, I get further demonized and retaliated against. And this is stuff that takes a lot of bravery for me to even be here today. I never thought coming to Canada that I would be treated that way. If I wanted to be treated that way, I could just go back over the border. So I just want to know what the plan is, because it's not just about me. It's about all of our people. I'm just more visible, I guess. But it's so what, this is a big issue. The lip service has to stop. The limousine liberalism in the city of Victoria has to stop. Okay, great. It's great that you have an orange shirt day, but the rest of the year I'm being bullied and harassed. So what are you going to do about it?
I think that's directed specifically at me, so I'm happy to take that. First of all, Rebecca, I'm sorry for your story. You and I have talked about this, and I appreciate that. I appreciate your candor and your courage and being able to stand up here. So I'm not going to talk specifically about Rebecca because that wouldn't be appropriate, but I will say that it's a great example of exactly the type of issues that you're all here talking about. because in every municipality, there are issues exactly like this, whether it's with indigenous people or a whole variety of whatever seems to make up the minority in each of your communities. It is incumbent on people like me and all of us to make sure that those stories are heard, first of all, really critical. And not only are they heard, but that they form the basis of what happens next. And so for me, I can speak only to the work that, and I'll speak very personally on this, the work that I've done with the city, with the two nations on whose territories the city sits, as we've talked about, and be able to speak to the fact that over the last number of years, we've worked with them at their direction, trying to find ways forward. And on both a systems level, obviously, between governments, but also on a very personal level between people. And it is the relationship that I believe that we have in depth with both of those nations that allows someone like Rebecca to stand here and know that she has the safety to say this truth. Because these are the truths that we're trying to respond to and deal with every single day. And the people that we work with at the two nations, both inside our systems, inside their systems, and in the new systems that were created, some of which I talked about earlier today, this is the future. And it's the future because there is a commitment on my behalf, on my city's behalf, on Rebecca's behalf, to create a new way of working and living together. That is my promise to you.
Thank you both for the question and for the thoughtful answer. Other questions, comments from the floor, a perspective from your city? Yeah.
To add on to what the mayor said, I think that, and Doreen talked about this at the during the panel earlier today, is that every city is on its own journey, and in addressing these issues. There are some cities who are not ready to acknowledge even that. We think about indigenous issues, that some cities aren't even ready to acknowledge that we're on indigenous lands. There are some cities that have given land back to some of the tribes in California. And so one of the things that the National League of Cities has done, specifically for the indigenous community, has created a roadmap of repair for a guidebook for cities to follow in terms of how they what they can do on different steps in their journey. And it's starting with land acknowledgements, going to beyond sort of that performative aspect into actual real concrete examples of how to sort of heal the relations with our indigenous nations. And so there are resources, and we have spent lots of time in this conference talking about best practices of how we move from rhetoric and recognition and empathy to actual concrete action.
Thank you for those additional remarks. Any other final comments from the panel before we wrap up and for tonight?
I'll add, at City Council, Edmontonians who wants to engage with us have 5 minutes to make the presentation at committees, right? But one thing that we are grappling with is that, how do you create space for more comprehensive or more inclusive and compassionate conversation when people who have been traumatized by this society come engage with you, right? Because when they engage, the trauma comes out. And that trauma brings emotions that sometimes make a lot of other people uncomfortable. So how do you create a space in a way that those people who are feeling uncomfortable need to understand why what is the reason for their discomfort in that conversation? That's a broader, I mean, systems needs to change, policies needs to change, procedures needs to change. But I think approach as we try to deal with more equitable engagement and more compassionate engagement, trying to bring people into the conversation, people who have been excluded from the process. People who understand the process engage with your institutions really well. But there's a lot of people who have been historically excluded from institutions, from governments, or harmed by governments and institutions. And there has to be a reflection on the engagement approach on that.
Yes.
I was going to say, I think it's really important as an elected official who really is just an old Girl Scout leader to remember that when with your elected officials in your communities, we're just one of the community, and the people in our community are our neighbors, and it's really important to make sure we continue to make sure we have that dialogue that's always going to be open between the two, and I think in our city we have an organization called For Our City. And what we've done is we brought in faith leaders, business leaders, nonprofits, and other organizations to be able to come in and work together to help solve issues that are in our community. Because the city can't do this alone. We have to have partners, and our partnerships are the people that are in our community and our businesses and our churches, and being able to reach out to them. And I think for me, at least personally, we were talking about thick skin earlier. When people get upset and they get angry at us, or they write a hateful email to us, we have to realize that really sometimes the issue is not us at all. It's just that we are the vessel that's standing in front of them that they can get angry at, and we reflect or we represent that issue that they're upset with. And I think as long as we continue to remember that those are our neighbors, and they remember that we're their neighbors, and that we work together to try to find a way to find a solution together, and that we look at that anger as not anger in that person, but a concern and an issue that they want solved, and we approach it with love and empathy, I think we could make a difference to really look at each other kindly and trying to work those solutions out together. And I think that's part of this hate thing, is turning hate into love is what we got to do.
Thank you. That's a nice way to end the evening. And I would just note that a lot of what we do as a Strong Cities Network is to take all the different practice examples, program examples, initiatives that we've heard from these 4 city leaders, and we amplify them, we share them through our resource hub, in our guides, so that what is said in Victoria doesn't stay in Victoria, and that when you go back to your city, even if you aren't a copious note taker, you will have access to our resources that capture these insights, and you can apply them in your city going forward. So with that, a huge round of applause to our 4 speakers.